I remember the exact texture of silence that used to fill my apartment on Sunday evenings. Not the comfortable kind of silence that settles around you like a warm blanket, but the kind that presses against your chest and makes you aware of every small sound your body produces. The slow exhale, the creak of the chair, the tap of fingers against a table that has no particular reason to be tapped. I was 34 years old, and I had become very good at filling that silence with productivity. Laundry folded into perfect rectangles. Meals prepped in identical containers. A calendar organized with the precision of someone who feared what might happen if a single hour went unaccounted for. My name is Daniel, and for most of my adult life, I understood myself through the lens of what I produced. I was a mid-level manager at a retail consulting firm, the kind of company that advised department stores on floor layout and customer flow. I knew, statistically, which aisle positioning increased impulse purchases by 14%. I understood consumer psychology in the abstract, detached way that people understand things they have studied rather than lived. I gave presentations with clean slides and confident language, and afterward, people nodded and wrote things in their notebooks, and I drove home in a car that was practical and gray, and I ate dinner at a table that seated four, but held only one. The loneliness did not arrive all at once. That is the thing no one tells you about loneliness. It does not announce itself. It seeps in through the small gaps in routine, through the moments when you realize that no one has said your name out loud in 3 days, through the particular ache of laughing at something on television and having nowhere to put the laughter. I had friends, technically, colleagues who became acquaintances, a brother in another city who called on birthdays, a history of relationships that had ended, each one, in the same quiet way, not with arguments or dramatic scenes, but with a mutual recognition that something essential was missing, that I was somehow not fully present even when I was physically there. I think, looking back, that I had learned very early how to be a certain kind of person, the kind who was reliable and steady, the kind who did not burden others. My father had been a quiet man of enormous practical capability. He could fix anything, build anything, and he expressed love through the language of usefulness. My mother had been warm but anxious, always managing the emotional temperature of the household, and I had understood, even as a small child, that the best thing I could do was to require very little maintenance. I became low maintenance in the way that a well-designed machine is low maintenance. I functioned. I performed my functions. And somewhere in the process, I misplaced the parts of myself that had nothing to do with function. The first time I noticed the dress was a Thursday. Not a particular Thursday, no anniversary, no birthday, nothing to mark it in memory except that it happened, and it changed something very small inside me that would, over years, become something much larger. I was in a department store conducting a routine audit of the women's section, analyzing traffic patterns, checking signage compliance, making notes on a clipboard that made me look purposeful. A woman was trying to find something for her daughter's graduation dinner, and she was overwhelmed by the options, and for reasons I cannot entirely explain, I stopped and helped her. I told her that the deep green dress on the third rack had a cut that would be both formal and comfortable. I told her that the fabric would move well and not require constant adjustment. I told her, without thinking, that the color would do something lovely under warm indoor lighting. She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and gratitude that I found disproportionate to what I had done. I had merely looked at a dress and understood it. But as I walked away, clipboard back in hand, I realized I had not merely looked at it. I had looked at it the way you look at something you recognize. There is a version of this story I could tell that would make the next part sound like a sudden awakening, a moment of revelation in which everything became clear. But that is not how it happened. What happened was much slower and much more honest than revelation. It happened the way erosion happens, through the patient, unremarkable work of water on stone, day after day, until one morning you look at the landscape and realize it has been quietly reshaping itself for years. After the Thursday in the department store, I went home and made dinner, and did not think about the green dress. Then, 2 weeks later, I was in a different store for a different audit, and I found myself pausing near a display of silk scarves. I touched one. Just touched it. Felt the weight of it across my fingers, the cool smoothness of it, the way it seemed to carry light differently than the surfaces around it. I told myself I was noting its retail positioning. I noted nothing. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, and then I folded the scarf back and walked away, and that night the Sunday silence felt, for the first time in months, slightly less pressing. I began, without conscious intention, to pay closer attention to certain things. The way fabric moved, the architecture of garments, how a well-constructed blouse distributed tension across the shoulders, how a particular collar changed the relationship between a face and the space around it. I told myself this was professional development. I was, after all, in retail consulting. Understanding product was part of my job. And this was true, technically, in the same way that many true things can be used to avoid a larger truth. The larger truth was this: I was lonely in a particular way that had nothing to do with the absence of other people. I was lonely for a version of myself that I had never allowed to exist. I had spent 34 years being comprehensible, to my parents, to my employers, to the people I dated, to the general social world that has strong preferences about who men are supposed to be and how they are supposed to relate to softness, to beauty, to the language of care and aesthetic attention that our culture assigns, arbitrarily and with great enforcement, to one gender and not another. I had been comprehensible, and in being comprehensible, I had compressed something essential into a very small space, and that compressed thing had been pressing against my ribs for so long that I had stopped noticing the pressure. The first purchase was unremarkable from the outside. A small bottle of hand cream from a brand I had seen in the women's section during an audit. I told myself my hands were dry. My hands were not especially dry. I brought it home and placed it on the bathroom shelf next to my ordinary unscented products, and that night I used it, and the ritual of applying it, the small deliberateness of it, the care directed inward, felt like something I did not have a word for. Not pleasure, exactly, though it was pleasant. More like recognition. Like hearing, faintly, a piece of music you had forgotten you knew. I developed a routine. This is the part one want to describe carefully because the routine was the thing, not as an endpoint or a performance but as a practice. The way meditation is a practice, or the way keeping a journal is a practice. Something done regularly with intention that gradually changes the quality of your inner life. I began to spend Sunday evenings differently. I would draw a bath, something I had not done since childhood, and I would take time with it, with the temperature and the stillness, with the simple dignity of caring for my own body not as a machine to be maintained but as something worth attending to. I would moisturize carefully. I would use the scented candle I had bought on a Thursday in October and told myself was for when guests came over, knowing no guests were coming. I would put on, eventually, the items I had begun quietly collecting: a pair of soft, wide-legged trousers and a fabric that moved when I moved. A sweater in a pale, warm color. Nothing dramatic. Nothing performative. Just softness. Just the particular piece that came from inhabiting for a few hours each week a version of myself that was not organized around usefulness. My boss's name was Margaret Chen, and she had been running the Eastern Division of the firm for 11 years with a combination of exacting professionalism and unexpected warmth that kept everyone perpetually slightly off balance in a way they found, ultimately, energizing. She was the kind of leader who noticed everything and commented on almost nothing, which was both her strength and the source of a particular ambient anxiety that hummed through every performance review. She noticed your work. She noticed your posture. She noticed the small shifts in a person's professional presentation over time, the way a good diagnostician notices subtle changes in a patient's color or gait before the patient has begun to notice anything themselves. I had worked for Margaret for 6 years. I respected her completely and was, in the professional sense, slightly afraid of her. Not of cruelty, which was not in her, but of her accuracy. She saw things clearly and said what she saw, and if you were operating under an illusion about your own performance or potential, Margaret would, with remarkable gentleness, remove it. The Saturday of the incident was a working Saturday, which happened occasionally when a major client was in the review cycle. I was at a flagship department store in the city, conducting a floor assessment alongside a junior colleague, when I encountered the stranger in the dress section. She was a woman perhaps 60 years old, standing before a rack of evening wear with an expression of patient bewilderment, the expression of someone who has been told they need to acquire a thing they do not know how to find. She was attending, she explained when our eyes met, and I made some small gesture of inquiry, her niece's wedding in 2 weeks. She had not been to a formal event in many years. She was not sure what was appropriate. She was not sure what would fit well. She was not sure, the way she said it, of quite a number of things. What happened next happened naturally, which is perhaps the most important thing about it. I did not make a decision. I simply responded. I looked at her height, her posture, the colors already in her clothing, the slight uncertainty in how she held herself, and I began to help. Not in the way a salesperson helps, with the language of persuasion and upselling, but in the way you help a person find something that is genuinely theirs. I moved through the rack with the ease of someone who had spent years paying attention to exactly this kind of thing, and I found 3 options, and I explained each one not in terms of trend or price, but in terms of what it would do, how it would move, how it would make her feel standing in a room, whether it would require management or would simply allow her to be present in her body without distraction. She was grateful in a way that was quiet and real. She chose the second option, a deep navy with a simple architecture that would, I knew, be exactly right. And as she walked toward the fitting room, I turned, and Margaret was standing 12 feet away with a tablet under her arm and an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. She had been there for an unknown amount of time. She said nothing immediately. She nodded once, in the way that contains a great deal, and then she walked toward the menswear section where she had business, and I stood in the women's department for a moment with the particular feeling of someone who has been seen doing something true and is waiting to understand what that means. Margaret called me into her office the following Wednesday. The meeting had been on the calendar since Monday with no subject line, which I had spent 2 days interpreting in various ways. I had performed the mental exercise of every possible conversation, rehearsed every clarification, prepared every professional explanation for what she might have observed. I was ready, in the way that a person who fears exposure is ready, defensively, with a version of the truth that protected the parts one was most uncertain about. She offered me tea, which she did not always do. She asked how the floor assessment had gone and listened to my summary with attention. And then she said, without preamble but also without anything sharp in it, I watched you with that woman on Saturday for about 10 minutes. You have a gift I haven't been using properly. I understood that she was speaking professionally. She was talking about the consultation, the floor work, the client-facing dimension of what she had observed. She was talking about moving me toward a client advisory role, something more human-facing than the data and auditing work I had been doing. This is what she went on to explain, and it was generous and it was accurate, and I received it with the professional gratitude it deserved. But something else happened in that meeting, something that had nothing to do with job titles or client portfolios. Something settled. The part of me that had been braced for exposure, for the discovery of the Sunday evenings, the collected softness, the private education of attention I had been conducting for 3 years, relaxed. Because Margaret had seen me help a stranger find a dress, and what she had seen was not something strange or requiring explanation. She had seen competence. She had seen care. She had seen a person who understood what they were looking at and used that understanding to serve someone else. The private and the professional had occupied, in my mind, entirely separate compartments. The person who spent Sunday evenings in soft fabric, learning to inhabit a gentler version of himself, and the person who gave presentations with clean slides, these had felt like irreconcilable selves, as though the existence of one undermined the legitimacy of the other. And in that Wednesday meeting, without a single word being spoken about any of it, something in the architecture of that separation began to give way. I thought about the hand cream on the bathroom shelf, and the green dress on the 3rd rack, and the silk scarf I had touched for 30 seconds on a Tuesday, and I understood for the first time that these had not been escapes from myself. They had been expeditions toward myself. The attention I had been paying, quietly and privately, to softness, to beauty, to the particular language of care embedded in how things are made and how they feel, that attention had not been a secret second life. It had been the continuation of my actual education, the part of my education that the rest of my life had not had room for. The phase of compression, of being low maintenance, of requiring very little, of folding myself into the acceptable shape, had served a purpose. I do not say this with bitterness, because bitterness would misrepresent it. The compression had been a survival strategy, and it had worked. I had survived. I had built something real, a career, a set of genuine competencies, a capacity for care that had simply been waiting for direction. What I was beginning to understand at 37 years old, in a Wednesday meeting about a job transition, was that survival strategies are not the same as living strategies, and that the transition between the two is not a dramatic event but a slow, patient reorientation, a turning, degree by degree, toward the light. The concept of the gentle transformation did not come to me as a concept. It came to me as a feeling, and only later did I find language for it. The feeling arrived on a Sunday evening in February, 2 months after the Wednesday meeting and 4 months after the Saturday in the department store. I had drawn a bath, as I had come to do. I had lit the candle that was no longer pretending to be for guests. I had put on, after, the wide-legged trousers and the pale sweater. I had made tea, not efficiently but deliberately, attending to each part of it. The temperature of the water, the steeping time, the particular ceramic mug that felt right in the hands. I sat at the table that seated 4, and I did not feel the absence of the other 3 chairs. I felt the presence of the one, my own presence, the full weight and texture of it, which I had spent a great deal of my life trying to minimize. I thought about what it means to transform. The word carries, in common use, a sense of drama, of before and after, of the caterpillar and the butterfly, of one thing becoming another thing through some decisive change. But what I had experienced was nothing like that. What I had experienced was more like what happens when you stop holding your breath. Not a transformation into something new, but a gradual relaxation into something that had always been there, waiting with the patience of something that knows it is not going anywhere. The gentle transformation, as I came to understand it, is not a change in identity. It is a change in relationship with identity. It is the slow work of releasing the grip of performed selfhood, the constant, exhausting performance of being only and exactly the person that external circumstances have required, and allowing something more complete to breathe. It does not require an audience. It does not require explanation. It requires only the willingness to take seriously the evidence of your own inner life. For me, that evidence had shown up in the way I touched a silk scarf on a Tuesday, in the way I looked at a green dress and recognized something, in the way a routine of small, private care, the cream, the bath, the fabric, the candle, had gradually restored a quality of presence that the performance of ordinariness had depleted. These were not symptoms of something to be managed. They were information. They were my own inner life, in its actual form, communicating something true. I changed roles at the firm. The client advisory work suited me in the way that things suit you when they draw on the full range of what you actually are. I was good with people in a new way, not the detached competence of someone who understands them statistically, but the warmer, more present attentiveness of someone who has learned to pay close attention to what people need and to offer it without judgment. Margaret noticed. She said, once, that I seemed more settled, and I said that I thought that was probably accurate, and she nodded in the way that contains a great deal, which was her way. I did not resolve anything dramatically. I did not arrive at a final version of myself. I do not think final versions of selves are available to anyone, and I have become suspicious of narratives that offer them. What I arrived at was something more modest and more durable, a daily practice of self-regard. The understanding that the quality of attention I bring to my own life, to my own comfort, my own preferences, the small languages of care I have developed over years of private education, is not self-indulgence. It is the foundation from which I am capable of bringing anything genuine to anyone else. The Sunday evenings are still quiet, but the silence is different now. It has a quality of arrival rather than absence, the feeling of someone who has traveled a long way and is, finally, in the right place. I make tea carefully. I sit at a table and feel my own presence in it without apology. I wear what is comfortable and right and mine. And outside, the city does whatever cities do, and inside there is a man who is learning, slowly, the particular piece of being fully present in his own life. Not transformed. Not arrived at some final shore, but moving, gently, in the right direction. And finding, in that gentle movement, something that has always been the most necessary thing, the simple, quiet, extraordinary experience of being at home in yourself.